The Last of Us has remained one of my favorite games since I first played the remastered PS4 edition over 6 years ago. The art style, which was vibrant while still containing a previously unseen degree of realism in both its world and character design, has allowed it to remain one of the best looking games out there even today. The immersive level design and tense stealth gameplay also worked to cement The Last of Us as a staple in the survival horror genre. However, it was the game's dialogue which felt so realistically conversational that enabled the relationships of its characters to feel genuine, and in my view was the primary factor which led to the game being one of, if not the greatest games of all time. Over a month ago, when images and clips from some of the game's key story moments began leaking online, I decided I would do everything possible to avoid these spoilers so that I can go into the game with a perspective unaffected by any kind of outside information. And so I avoided most promotional material for the game, especially being wary of comments, afraid that I would learn of something that would affect my experience of the game before I'd even played it. I wish to form a perception of the game solely based off of my reaction to its content, not toward isolated spoilers or segments. However, as the release date for the game drew closer and the negative buzz around it grew louder, I couldn't help tangentially hearing reactions toward the elements of the game that were leaked. In reacting to these spoilers, I heard how many felt that The Last of Us Part 2 disgraced the name of the original game, and even how it was bad fanfiction. I couldn't help but find myself feeling increasingly nervous that The Last of Us Part 2 was going to be a massive disappointment. The Last of Us 2 is a fantastic game, and while it's not exactly perfect, it is a sequel that more than lives up to the original. The story this time around is a much linear, more complex web of conflicting character goals and motivations, which become increasingly muddled as the story progresses. Many have seemed to have forgotten that Joel in the first game makes decisions based on personal gains and desires rather than being driven by a strong moral compass. This form of self-centered decision-making and its consequences likewise makes up the backbone of the storytelling in The Last of Us Part 2. The excellent performances, writing, and direction have all worked to create memorable cutscenes which exude cinematic atmosphere, as well as tense gameplay sequences which require fast decision-making on the part of the player. While The Last of Us Part 2 is a much lengthier experience than its predecessor, I was never bored in my time with the game. The variety in locales that gameplay sequences take place in, along with the nuanced patterns of movement the NPCs utilized, kept gameplay consistently feeling new and interesting. This was especially the case with human NPCs, whose detailed and unpredictable walking patterns kept me constantly on my toes. You can't just keep hiding in tall grass while you wait for enemies to get close to you. Inevitably, you will get caught. This causes the player to constantly be moving and thinking on their feet. The game is constantly placing you in unique environments that you need to adapt to in order to survive. From swampy marshes to ruined department stores surrounded by dogs, to dark and dingy hospital floors teeming with infected. The terrain and enemy types you face off against need to be taken into consideration when wondering how to react to the particular environment you're in. In addition, I found that the later portion of the game had a variety of interesting and uniquely scripted scenarios that kept me on the edge of my seat and continuously ramped up the tension in gameplay. In regards to the story of The Last of Us Part 2, well, there's just no way for me to discuss it properly without getting into major spoilers. I'm going to be discussing the entire game, covering most of the major plot points, my reactions to them, and whatever insights I may have. In addition, I will be discussing plot points from the first game where I feel it's necessary. So, if you're watching this and you've yet to be aware of the major plot points in either The Last of Us Part 2 or the first game, this is your one and only warning. As the game opens, we are reunited with an Ellie who is 5 years older than where we left off with her in the previous game. We are then introduced to Dina, a close friend of Ellie's who we learned she shared a drunken kiss with the night before, and Jesse, Ellie's friend and Dina's ex-boyfriend. Dina and Ellie head out on a patrol route together in a snowstorm. They are later found by Jesse, who explains that Joel and Tommy, who were also on patrol, have gone missing. At the same time, we play as Abby, a girl who is saved by Joel and Tommy after she is attacked by infected. Abby brings the two brothers with her to a mountainside lodge that her and her friends have been staying in. Abby then reveals that her group has come to Jackson looking for Joel, and she attacks him. Abby shoots Joel in the leg, ties him up, and begins to brutally beat him with a golf club. After Joel is attacked, Ellie finds him and is made to watch as the situation unfolds. This brings us to the biggest point of contention with The Last of Us 2 from the fanbase: Joel's brutal murder at the hands of Abby. Many fans of both The Last of Us and Joel as a character seemed to have a visceral gut reaction to his death. They seemed to feel incredibly angry and upset, and that seems to be the point of the developers. The point is for you to feel what Ellie feels in this situation. Her anger at Joel's brutal murder that she had no control over and no opportunity to try and stop. Joel stood no chance. There was no way he could have gotten himself out of this situation. It isn't fair for him in the slightest. He had no hope of survival. And that's the point. It's supposed to be unfair. It's supposed to be a disgusting and unseemly way to kill off this beloved character. The fact that this scene is able to elicit these kinds of intense emotions in the player means that it was constructed properly. This brutal incident is supposed to help put the player in Ellie's shoes, to enable them to desire a cathartic revenge toward the individuals that executed such a horrific act towards such a beloved character. At least at this point in the game. And yet, so many individuals seem to be hung up on the death itself, to the point that they are seemingly ignoring most of the game and the experience of playing it, instead of allowing these emotions of anger toward Abby to fuel them into desiring to play the game and immersing themselves in the story in the hopes of seeing Ellie exact her revenge. To be honest, I find it a bit strange at how surprised many people are that the writers chose to open the game in this manner, considering that in many respects, this prologue section mirrors the prologue of the first game. The first Last of Us begins in modern day, where we are introduced to Joel and his daughter Sarah during the start of the Cordyceps outbreak. Just as Joel and Sarah are about to reach safety, Sarah is shot and killed by a soldier, who was ordered to kill anyone who tried to pass his post. This death looms over Joel throughout the game, having an adverse effect on how he initially views Ellie, and leading to him eventually treating her like a daughter as a way to make up for his loss. The Last of Us is at its core a game about how we all need someone or something to believe in, to protect, to care for, in order to have any reason to be able to keep going, especially when living in difficult circumstances. In keeping with the themes and structure of the first game, it makes sense for The Last of Us Part 2 to open how it does. The first game is a story of a character whose decisions and views of the world are affected by a horrible tragedy that occurred to someone they loved. It makes perfect sense for this to once again be the primary motivating factor in the second game. And if we are now following Ellie's perspective, who better than Joel to serve this function in the story? Sure, the writers could have killed off Dina in the opening act of the game and used her death to be the focus of Ellie's vengeance toward Abby, as was suggested in some of the game's promotional material. However, I don't think this would have been nearly as engaging to the player. Dina and Ellie's relationship is not given nearly enough time in this short section of the game to be properly developed. The player is not given an accurate sense of how much Ellie cares for Dina in this point of time. Therefore, making the game's plot revolve around Ellie seeking vengeance for a character we barely know anything about, or whose relationship with Ellie we don't fully understand, would not have been nearly as effective. In order to make this revenge story starring Ellie realize to its fullest potential, Joel needed to be the one that Abby kills. I believe that a stronger argument that could be made against the game's story is that revenge does not need to be the primary motivator for Ellie's story at all. Maybe they could have used some other driving force outside of vengeance to jumpstart Ellie's journey. I'm sure there could have been a way to make an effective story with some other factor causing Ellie to leave Jackson County, but for the life of me, I can't think of anything quite as effective as seeking Joel's revenge. Ellie lives a comfortable life with people who care about her. And while we later learn that Ellie's relationship with Joel had been rocky due to reasons we will discuss later, I don't think the strained relationship would be enough to cause her to leave Jackson, considering the various other support systems that are there for her. Personally, I don't think there is another catalyst quite as effective as Joel's death. Shortly after Joel's murder, Ellie leaves with Dina and heads to Seattle, following Tommy, who had left to seek vengeance against Abby and her friends on his own. The pair heads off in search of the WLF, or Wolves, as this is the military group that Abby and her friends are a part of. As we follow Ellie, her relationship with Dina grows stronger, and we see the pair bond throughout their journey, their experiences of mutual survival strengthening their relationship. The two eventually take shelter in an abandoned theater and use it as their base of operations. There, after seeing Dina in a weak and sick state, Dina reveals to Ellie that she believes she is pregnant. Ellie continues her quest for vengeance on her own, while Dina remains in the theater. Eventually, Jesse appears to help Ellie get her revenge, having followed her and Dina from Jackson. In her quest to find Abby, Ellie kills several of Abby's friends, most of which were present for Joel's death, culminating in her killing two characters named Owen and Mel. We learn later on that Abby and Owen have been close for years and have a romantic connection with each other, while Mel is Owen's pregnant girlfriend. Tommy then appears, and the two regroup with Jesse and Dina at the theater. There, Tommy convinces Ellie to come back to Jackson with the rest of the group and leave her revenge behind. Abby then confronts Ellie at the theater after finding Owen and Mel's corpses. Abby kills Jesse, shoots Tommy, and is about to kill Ellie when we suddenly flash back to 4 years prior. I felt that the game up until this point was near perfect. The game did a good job of emulating the natural kind of dialogue and exploration sections that appeared in the first game. These instances of dialogue were one of the reasons the first game's characters felt so real, and it was an innovative way to have development between characters occur outside of cutscenes, helping to foster a realistic sense of relationship growth between characters. The Last of Us Part 2 emulates these moments very well, and just as they were in the first game, these kinds of conversations feel very natural, once again working to demonstrate a realistic sense of development in the relationships between characters. I appreciate how the writers didn't just recreate Ellie's personality from the first game. In the first game, she was 14, a carefree child. Ellie's gone through a lot these past 5 years, and it makes sense for these events to have had an impact on her personality and her personal worldview. Just like with the first game, The Last of Us Part 2 crafts what feels like a believable world along with characters whose ways of interacting with each other and personal choices feel very real. One complaint I've heard about The Last of Us Part 2 is that Ellie is not a hero, which is surprising to me considering the depiction of Joel in the first game. Nearly every decision Joel made in the game was out of his own selfishness. He agrees to transport Ellie in exchange for weapons. He brutally tortures people to find out her location. And when he realizes Ellie is going to be killed in order to produce a vaccine, he kills everyone in the Firefly Hospital, including a doctor. Joel selfishly sacrifices the chance for humanity to potentially bring an end to the cordyceps infection in order for him to maintain his bond with Ellie. The Last of Us has never been about depicting characters with strong morals. It's been about depicting characters who make choices in order to find personal satisfaction in a desolate world. Characters who feel like real people. The Last of Us 2 is continuing that tradition of character-driven storytelling. After Abby points her gun at Ellie, the game gives us a flashback from Abby's perspective, which shows us how the doctor who was going to operate on Ellie from the first game was Abby's father, and that Abby and her friend group that attacked Joel were all former Fireflies whose friends and loved ones were brutally murdered by Joel. After this flashback, we are then taken back to the beginning of the 3-day period that has been taking place since Ellie and Dina arrived in Seattle, only this time we see this period from Abby's perspective. This for me was the biggest snag of the game. I like this section of the game. I enjoy how we are able to play from Abby's perspective, helping to humanize her character rather than relegating her to simply being a weakly motivated villain. Abby's depiction as a person who makes emotionally charged choices in order to satisfy selfish motives enables her to fit in with how every other major character is depicted in the series. Also, as I alluded to earlier, Abby's portion of the story has some of the more exciting gameplay sequences, which include a horseback ride through a burning town, a nail-bitingly tense fight in a decrepit basement with a strange form of infected, as well as a sequence across a sky bridge. Abby's portion of the game is filled with exciting and unique sequences such as these. My point of contention here is how this section of the story ruins the momentum of the game. After Abby breaks into the theater, tensions rise as the story builds to a climactic conclusion. However, that tension is ruined once the game cuts to the flashback of Abby with her father. At this point, we are a little less than halfway through the game, meaning that it will be hours before we revisit this dramatic moment as Abby and get a resolution to the built-up tension surrounding this climactic point in the story. As I stated previously, the content of Abby's section of the game is perfectly fine to me. The problem is how this part of the game deflates the tense confrontation that we had been building toward playing as Ellie. Personally, I think it would have been better if this section played out alongside Ellie's, with the player switching perspectives perhaps every 3 hours or so. This way, the player can feel the tension building in each respective character's journeys, and it would be easy to understand early on that Abby's character has depth, that there is more to her life and her motivations than just going around murdering fan-favorite characters. The player could experience the rising tensions in both stories as they each reach their climax near simultaneously, preventing any tension from being deflated since there isn't a dramatic shift from a point of tension as is the case. Going back to the story now, as we play as Abby, we learn of what her life is like in the WLF. The Wolves have been at war with a deeply fanatical, religious cult known as the Scars or Seraphites, whose home base is an island just off the Seattle coast. Abby's story begins when Owen goes missing after he killed another member of their friend group, Jordan. Abby sets off on a quest to clear his name. Along the way, she meets two Scars, Yara and Lev, who have defected. Abby encounters them after she is caught by a group of Scars and nearly hung. Yara is held down and has her wings clipped. One of her arms is severely broken. Lev rescues Yara and Abby brings them to a safe spot, leaving them there. Abby then heads to an abandoned aquarium that she and Owen used to frequent in order to search for him. Abby finds Owen and learns that Owen killed Jordan after a scuffle which resulted from Jordan wanting to kill an elderly Scar in cold blood. After hearing Owen's story, Abby decides to check on Yara and Lev, feeling guilty for leaving them in such a vulnerable state. Abby, upon finding Yara in critical condition, brings her and Lev to Owen, now accompanied by Mel, who is a medic. Abby learns that Yara has compartment syndrome and will die without the proper tools and medications necessary for amputating her arm. Abby then heads to the primary medical facility used by the Wolves with Lev. This mission makes up a decent portion of Abby's section of the game. During this time, Abby and Lev bond as they rely on each other to survive various harrowing experiences, such as a hotel overrun with infected and the previously mentioned Skybridge section. During this time, Lev mentions how he was born as a girl named Lily. However, he always preferred living as a man. After being told that he was assigned to live as a wife instead of a soldier like he had intended, he shaved his head, which is customary of Seraphite men. This action caused both himself and Yara, who defended him, to be sentenced to death by their people. I have no problem with the game wanting to discuss transgender rights, but to be honest, this feels a little tacked on here. It doesn't really contribute to the story in any way. You could easily remove several quick lines of dialogue and it wouldn't have an impact on the story as a whole. Some have looked at this moment as though it were included to perpetuate some kind of PC agenda, but it doesn't come across that way to me. The moment doesn't appear to have the intention of spreading a message about transgender rights. Abby and Lev don't give some kind of grand speech about the importance of such rights. The moment doesn't contain any kind of message in my view. It only exists to provide interesting background to the character. Sure, it feels a little tacked on, out of left field, and it could have been developed further in order to have more of an impact. But while it doesn't really add much to the game's story other than providing a bit of background information, it doesn't take anything away from the experience of the game either. After a face-off with the creature I mentioned earlier in the hospital's lower levels, Abby manages to retrieve the proper supplies and she and Lev bring them back to Yara, saving her life. Owen discusses leaving for Santa Barbara, where he has heard several rumors that there are a group of fireflies. Lev then leaves on his own to the island that the Scars live on in order to try and reconcile with his and Yara's extremely devout mother, who has apparently been outraged by Lev's recent behavior. Abby and Yara pursue him. After finding Lev, Yara is fatally shot by Isaac, the leader of the Wolves. Isaac is then about to kill Lev before Abby stands in front of him, trying to desperately explain to him that Lev has defected and is no longer a Scar. Isaac refuses to listen to reason, hell-bent on killing the Scar in front of him despite the fact that he is a young boy, unable to see him as anything more than an enemy to his people. Yara then shoots Isaac as the last action before death, presumably killing him. Abby then leaves with Lev as they try to escape the island, which is now burning down around them, as the Scars and Wolves fight. The brutal and chaotic cacophony of violence that occurs as two sides who each view the other as hedonistic and untrustworthy enemies is on full display in this sequence. Abby and Lev, having escaped the island, return to Owen and Mel, finding them dead. After finding the map that Ellie left behind with the location of her group at the theater, Abby and Lev head to the climactic point where Ellie's story previously left off. Abby and Ellie fight. It was at this point that I felt the concept of the game truly shined. You see, by this point in the game, Abby was in a similar position to Joel in the first game, developing a growing bond with a child in order to try and retain some of her humanity to equalize herself from the horrible actions she's committed. Although it may be a bit of a stretch, one could even argue that it was the fact that she was the one who carried out Joel's brutal murder, which led to Abby protecting Yara and Lev in an attempt to salvage what little moral structure there was to her character. The relationship between Abby and Lev isn't nearly as fleshed out as the one between Joel and Ellie in the first game, but still, using nearly half the game in order to portray this relationship does do its job in humanizing Abby. Like with Ellie and Joel, the game depicts Abby as a person who makes choices that are impulsive, selfish, and many times questionable, but that are nonetheless understandable given her circumstances. And that ultimately is the reason why I respect the game's writing, because it's okay to not always be able to condone a fictional character's behavior. Media as a whole would be pretty boring if every character was a perfectly moral knight in shining armor. What's important is that you're able to empathize with the character, to understand why they might make a decision given their particular personalities, character flaws, and the circumstances of the situation they're in, even if you may not personally agree with the choices they make. Based on some of the reactions to the game, it seems that there are people who have a harder time accepting some of the horrible and brutal actions of the characters because, unlike with film or other media, in games we the player are in control of the character. In a certain respect, some might even say that we are in control of a character's actions, making the brutally depicted violence in the game more sickening and horrific for these individuals. Of course it's upsetting for me as a huge fan of the character that Joel was brutally murdered by Abby. However, after learning that Abby killed Joel because her father was the doctor he viciously murdered at the Firefly Hospital, I can understand her desire to seek vengeance upon him. Do I agree and support the choice she made? Of course not. But that's not the point. A character's choice may not be the best when judged by individuals not influenced by the emotions of the character and playing through the story from the outside looking in, but that doesn't mean that the choice in question isn't the one a character is most likely to make. The point of the game's story is that violence begets violence. Choosing to kill someone in the name of revenge will likely only serve to damage those closest to the person you're seeking vengeance on, whether that be physically, like what Ellie did to Owen and Mel, or emotionally, like what Joel's death did to Ellie. Either way, vengeance will only lead to more violence and suffering. Only by letting go of desires that stem from anger can a person and those closest to them truly be at peace. The writers did not depict cruel deaths such as Joel's and Jesse's simply for the sake of being cruel, but for the sake of demonstrating the message of the game's story. Returning to the story, Abby brutally beats Ellie, winning their fight, and as she is about to kill her, Dina intervenes. However, Abby subdues her as well and prepares to slit her throat. Ellie exclaims that Dina is pregnant, but Abby, seemingly uncaring about this detail, especially after Ellie killed the pregnant Mel, is about to proceed with her murder of Dina anyway. However, just as she's about to commit this horrific act, Lev tells her to stop. Abby does so, claiming she never wants to see Ellie again before leaving with Lev. We then flash forward sometime later, most likely a year, to see Ellie and Dina living happily along with JJ, Dina's son. Ellie seems to have a stable, peaceful life. However, PTSD-like flashbacks of Joel keep occurring in her mind, interrupting this tranquility. Meanwhile, Lev and Abby are in Santa Barbara, where they access a radio and find out about a group of fireflies. They are then attacked by the Rattlers, a local group that kidnaps Abby and Lev in order to use them as slaves. After a particularly violent episode transports her to the scene of Joel's death while she's with JJ, Ellie decides that in order to get closure for Joel's death and to stop being haunted by it, she must kill Abby once and for all. She tracks Abby down to Santa Barbara, where she faces off against the Rattlers. After dispatching all of the Rattlers she finds Abby, barely alive and strung up on a pillar. Ellie lets her go and forces Abby to fight after she threatens to kill Lev with her knife if she does not settle things with her once and for all. A violent brawl ensues in the shallow waters by the shoreline. During the fight, Abby bites off 2 of Ellie's fingers. Ellie eventually manages to maneuver herself on top of Abby and begins to drown her. However, she stops just short of killing her upon remembering a moment of Joel with his guitar. Upon envisioning this peaceful fragment of a memory about Joel, she lets Abby go and tells her to leave. Abby gets on a boat with Lev and drives off. It is in this moment that Ellie comes to the realization that vengeance only brings upon it a vicious cycle of brutality. In order to hold on to the memories of Joel that mean so much to her, she needs to let go of what happened to him and move on with her life. However, this realization came too late, as when she finally returns to her home, Dina and JJ are gone. The only things that remain in the house are her own. And as she tries to play the guitar one last time, the activity that both she and Joel shared a bond over, and that throughout the game she had used as a tool to reconnect with Joel through her memories, she finds that due to her missing fingers, she is unable to. In her quest for vengeance, the only thing that came about of it was her own self-destruction. This self-destruction manifested itself physically in the form of her lost fingers, and her mother's switchblade, which she lost in her fight in Santa Barbara. It also came in the form of her lost connections with the one she cared about most, including Joel. And yet, as she struggles to play the guitar, we see the full memory we saw a snippet of earlier when Ellie was fighting Abby. In several flashbacks throughout the game, we learned that Ellie and Joel's relationship had become increasingly strained in the years since the end of the first game. This is because of Ellie's suspicions and later confirmed knowledge that Joel lied about the Fireflies no longer needing her for a cure. However, as Ellie calmly struggles to play her guitar, we learn from this final flashback that as Joel was playing his guitar on his porch the night before his death, Ellie went to visit him. In her conversation with Joel, Ellie claimed that she wanted to try and forgive him, even though she thought it might not be possible, and that she would like to reconcile with him. Joel responded that if given the chance, he would have chosen to save her all over again, as opposed to letting her die for the sake of humanity. Up until this point, Ellie's memories of Joel have either been of his brutal death, or ones where she was mired in distrust and suspicion of him. The fact that her relationship with Joel had become so strained haunted Ellie. However, now that she has let go of the negative emotions that failed to bring about a single positive change in her life, she is able to not only remember Joel as the kind father figure he was, but she is also able to remember that in the end, she did try her best to forgive him. In being able to relive this memory, she is able to be content with her relationship with Joel and how it ended. I loved The Last of Us 2. Was it perfect? Not quite, but it was pretty close if you ask me. The variety in how the player is able to approach how they handle confrontations made playing through them dynamic and fun. I loved how the player would be basically dead if caught in the open while surrounded, requiring them to think carefully and quickly, along with forcing them to consider the various unique items that can be crafted, such as trip mines and pistol silencers. However, scarce resources leave the player needing to make decisions, oftentimes very quickly, in regards to what they should choose to craft. Giving the player the ability to crawl as well as jump added a whole new level of variety to how enemies can be maneuvered around and how encounters can be undertaken in comparison to the first game, which I thoroughly enjoyed. Once again, I have to reiterate how beautiful this game is from an artistic point of view. The facial animations add an uncanny degree of realism to the characters. The world is lit beautifully, and the performances are top-notch. Ashley Johnson in particular did a great job playing Ellie once again. In fact, everything from an artistic and design perspective was completely perfect. Where there were a few wrinkles for me was the story. The story, as mentioned previously, feels lengthier and less focused than the first game. All in all, I felt this to be a double-edged sword. On one hand, this kind of ambitious, multi-perspective form of storytelling allowed for there to be more events, characters, and more plot ideas and themes than the first game, giving The Last of Us Part 2 an almost novelistic feel. This leaves the player feeling like they are undertaking an epic journey in game form. There were so many more memorable, grand in scope gameplay sequences than the first Last of Us. However, this storytelling technique sacrifices the level of focus that the first game had. In the first game, the focus of the story was Ellie and Joel's relationship, their bond. Nearly everything that happened to the characters served to help develop that bond. The Last of Us Part 2 is much more interested in using its characters as a means to tell a story about its themes, rather than telling a story solely about its characters. Sure, there were themes in the first Last of Us, particularly about how we all need someone to love even when life feels hopeless, but these felt more like tangential byproducts of the motivations of the characters. With The Last of Us Part 2, it sometimes felt like the themes came first, before the characters. This has bothered some people, but while I do recognize the issues with a lack of focus and story, for me this is not a major concern. This is simply a different form of storytelling than the first game. Does it have its negatives? Sure, but it also has the ability to tell a grander story, an ability the first game's form of storytelling lacked. As mentioned previously, my biggest issue with this game was the way the game was paced, and how that structure deflates the game's tension. As I've said, I actually quite like the idea of telling the story with split perspectives. This enables the player to easily understand the viewpoints of two conflicting characters. However, each individual story felt a bit underdeveloped. For me, this problem stems from just how much happens to each respective character in their stories in relatively short periods of time. Ellie and Abby each deal with a variety of different plot points in a short span of time, quickly dealing with each situation and moving to the next one. The first game, in comparison, was made up of a handful of long sequences, as opposed to a large number of short ones. This is especially noticeable in Abby's portion of the game. The bond between Abby and Lev, which is the relationship that is at the beating center of Abby's story, does not feel like it is properly given enough time to fully develop. Abby's relationship with Lev is only one part of her story, so it is covered in a relatively short time frame, especially considering that Abby's story is less than half the game. It's not that Abby and Lev's bond isn't believable, it simply feels rushed. Over the span of only several sequences, Abby goes from being ambivalent toward Lev to addressing him as though he's her younger brother. All in all, I don't think the story of The Last of Us Part 2 is bad whatsoever. In fact, I think it's pretty amazing. Yes, there are some noticeable issues in regards to pacing, and these issues do have an effect on how I score the game, but that doesn't change the fact that everything else about the game, story or otherwise, is fantastic, with great writing and direction, along with nearly every other element of the game's construction. It's especially important to consider just how ambitious this story is for the video game medium. Yes, there have been games that tackle this kind of grand cinematic form of storytelling, such as Red Dead Redemption 2, but they're few and far between. Even with its pacing issues, I still think that The Last of Us Part 2 is near perfect. I'm going to give the game a 9 out of 10.